Welcome to Sleep with Secrets, where bedtime gets darker and secrets never sleep. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories disappear before they're ever heard again. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? I'd like to know where the secrets are spreading. Now get comfortable and let's get started. Story 1. On the cold morning of January 13, 1995, a groundskeeper at the University of Tennessee made a grim discovery in Tyson Park, Knoxville. What he first mistook for an animal turned out to be the lifeless body of a young woman. She was brutally beaten, her clothes torn and scattered, and the scene around her painted in blood. This was not a typical crime scene. This was something far worse. Her body lay next to a mound of disturbed dirt. Blood soaked the ground around her, and her shirt and undergarments were thrown into the nearby trees. The scene stretched over 100 feet wide, a large, chaotic trail of violence. Nearby, pieces of broken asphalt were scattered, all stained with blood. The investigators would later find that these pieces of pavement had been used as weapons. Detectives from the Knoxville Police Department and forensic experts rushed to the scene. Even the most seasoned officers were shaken by the horror they encountered. The young woman had sustained massive head injuries. Her skull was broken open. In some places, her wounds were so deep that brain tissue was exposed. Despite the blood and damage, one detail stood out as especially disturbing. Carved into her chest was a large pentagram, a 5-pointed star enclosed in a circle. The shape was unmistakable. To those on the scene, it evoked fears of ritualistic violence, something that stirred memories of the nationwide satanic panic that had gripped the United States in the previous decade. But this wasn't just fear-mongering. This was real. And in a city filled with college students, Job Corps trainees, and parents sending their children away for education and opportunity, the brutal murder of a young woman in such a public place threatened to ignite that old panic all over again. Investigators faced a massive task. The crime scene spanned a large area. There were drag marks in the mud, suggesting the victim had been moved during the attack or had tried to crawl away. Her prints were everywhere. She had clearly fought for her life. Nearby, detectives found a large slab of pavement, later determined to be a piece of the path that wound through the park. It had been used as a weapon, likely the one that caused the most significant head injuries. From the number of fragments and the amount of blood found on them, investigators believed the attack had taken a long time. This wasn't an impulsive act. This was something fueled by rage. What worried detectives even more than the brutality was the symbolism, the pentagram, the missing piece of skull, the manner of the injuries. Could this be a cult killing? And if so, were more victims at risk? Before they could even answer that, they needed to know, who was this girl? The first real lead came quickly. A woman from Jackson, Tennessee called the police. She hadn't been able to reach her daughter, who was attending the local Job Corps program near the park. The woman was panicked. She'd heard about the murder on the news and knew her daughter had mentioned disturbing things about some students involved in strange behavior. She named her daughter Colleen Slemmer. When police checked the Job Corps dormitory, Colleen wasn't there. A sign-out sheet confirmed she'd left the building the previous night and never returned. Worse, she had signed out with 3 other students. All of them had come back, except Colleen. A teacher came forward soon after. He had seen Colleen on the night of January 12th, the night of the murder. She had seemed happy. She told him she had just come back from Christmas break and was proud of the pink sweater she had received as a gift. She was looking forward to the new year. Based on the teacher's identification and the sign-out logs, the detectives had a name to match their victim. Colleen Slemmer, 17 years old, a student of Job Corps, smart, quiet, and passionate about computers. Dental records would later confirm the identification. Her mother, May Martinez, was devastated. She remembered how excited her daughter had been when she left after the holidays, ready to start the next chapter of her life. Now, that chapter had ended in horror. and the question turned to why. Why would someone target Colleen? Why was she so violently attacked? And who were the other 3 students she signed out with that night? The forensic work at Tyson Park continued late into the day. Police officers, detectives, and crime scene technicians carefully documented every inch of the area. The mud revealed handprints, marks of a desperate struggle. Blood was splattered in multiple directions, showing the victim had moved or been moved during the attack. This wasn't just a place where a body had been left. It was where Colleen had fought for her life. Pieces of asphalt were everywhere. Some were large and broken, others shattered into smaller bits. All bore traces of blood. Based on the damage to Colleen's head, detectives concluded that she had been hit repeatedly with these heavy objects. Each strike took time. Each required intent. The attack had lasted for more than 45 minutes, and it had been deeply personal. Colleen was nude from the waist up. Her jeans remained on, mostly clean and free from blood and dirt, leading detectives to conclude that the attack was not sexually motivated. This detail, later confirmed by the medical examiner, ruled out one common motive. The medical examiner's findings made things even more disturbing. Colleen's body had been slashed repeatedly with a box cutter. Her throat had been cut 7 separate times. Her head had suffered multiple impacts, and one piece of her skull was missing, not shattered and scattered, but surgically removed. It was only after the body had been washed for autopsy that the pentagram became fully visible. Carved directly into her chest, it stretched from shoulder to shoulder and from collarbone to below her ribs. It had been done with a steady hand. To investigators, it seemed almost impossible to ignore the signs. In the middle of the satanic panic era, when fears about cults and rituals ran high, this crime bore all the hallmarks of a supposed ritualistic killing. But was it a genuine ritual, or was someone trying to make it look like one? Back at the station, detectives held a private meeting. They didn't want to cause panic. Rumors about satanic rituals and cults could spiral out of control quickly, especially in a city like Knoxville with its large student population. So far, the media knew only the basics. A young woman had been found dead in Tyson Park. Detectives decided to keep the ritualistic details, especially the pentagram, out of the public eye. Only those directly involved in the investigation were told the full truth. Meanwhile, panic had already begun to spread. Parents were calling the University of Tennessee and Job Corps, desperate to hear from their children. Some pulled their kids out of school. Others contacted the police directly with fears and tips. One of those tips came from Colleen's own mother. Her call helped detectives trace Colleen to Job Corps and gave them the first real break in the case. Now they needed to look closely at the 3 students who had signed out with her that night. And what they found next would take the investigation in a new, chilling direction. The Knoxville branch of Job Corps was located just a short walk from Tyson Park. It was a federally funded program meant to help young adults, often from low-income backgrounds, learn trades and transition into the workforce. Students could study anything from culinary arts to computer programming, and they lived on campus in dormitories. In 1995, the dorms were separated by gender. Female students lived on one floor, male students on others. Students shared common areas and communal bathrooms. There were rules, curfews, limits on room visits between male and female students, and a strict sign-in and sign-out policy. That's how detectives were able to identify the 3 students who had signed out with Colleen on the night she was killed. All 3 returned without her. The names: Krista Pike, her boyfriend Tadderell Ship, and their friend Shadola Peterson. One teacher, after hearing the news about the murder, stepped forward. He remembered seeing Colleen that evening. She had been in a good mood, wearing a pink sweater she had received for Christmas. He had no idea that it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Krista Pike was the queen bee of the Job Corps program. At only 18, she stood out. Fiery red hair, a commanding presence, and a mix of charm and cruelty that made others follow her or fear her. She had a way of pulling people in, making them feel important, only to turn on them without warning. Those who knew her said she was unpredictable. One moment she was kind and affectionate, the next she could be vicious. Tadero Ship, 17, was Krista's boyfriend. He studied culinary arts and had a reputation for being laid back, until he wasn't. When angry, Tadero could become explosive, and he had a dark side that made many of his classmates uneasy. He openly claimed to be a Satanist. His dorm room was said to be decorated with candles, a pentagram, and other symbols. Some thought it was just a way to shock people. Others believed he meant it. Krista, infatuated with him, adopted his beliefs. Friends said she began participating in rituals, kneeling at his altar, and calling herself Little Devil to match Tadero's tattoo, which read Baby Satan. Shadola Peterson, the quietest of the trio, seemed to follow Krista's lead. She was eager to please and did what Krista told her to. She rarely questioned anything. Those close to her said she wanted to fit in and would do anything to stay in Krista's favor. Together, these three formed a tight and dangerous bond, one that would soon erupt into violence. Krista Pike's life was marked by chaos long before she arrived at Job Corps. Her early years were a cycle of instability, neglect, and pain. Her parents divorced when she was a toddler, remarried a year later, and then divorced again 2 years after that. Her mother struggled with her own issues, including a suicide attempt, and Krista often found herself caught in the middle. As a young child, Krista was reported to have been found crawling through filth in the house, left alone and uncared for. Her aunt described the home as unfit, with Krista surrounded by dog waste and trash. Seizures went untreated, needs went unmet. She was eventually taken in by her paternal grandmother, who provided some stability. But when her grandmother died in 1988, Krista's fragile sense of safety collapsed. She was only 12 years old when she attempted to take her own life. Her father accused her of sexually abusing a younger sibling, and she was kicked out of his house. Krista denied the accusations, and later in life she claimed she had been the victim of sexual abuse herself, a claim that was dismissed by many due to her reputation for dishonesty and manipulation. Still, her behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. She was arrested for threatening a former boyfriend with a butcher knife and spent time in a juvenile facility. Her time there led her to Job Corps, a chance, she thought, to start over. But the darkness that had followed her from childhood never left. At Job Corps, Krista quickly rose to prominence. She was intelligent, funny, and knew how to command attention. But she was also manipulative, controlling, and cruel. Those who lived in the dorms said Krista treated the environment like her own personal kingdom. She gathered friends, demanded loyalty, and punished anyone who crossed her. She bonded instantly with Tadero's ship. To outsiders, it looked like an intense teenage romance. To those closer, it was something darker. The two were inseparable, always in each other's rooms, breaking rules, and performing bizarre rituals. Together, they worshipped symbols of evil, and their behavior unsettled the rest of the dorm. Krista's friends, especially her roommate Kim and two other girls, Amy and Shadola, all became part of her inner circle. Among them was Colleen Slemmer, who, like Krista, had joined Job Corps to build a better future. Colleen was shy, thoughtful, and bright. She loved computers and books. She wasn't interested in drama or dating, but when she waved hello to Tadero one day in the hallway, Krista decided that Colleen was a threat. Krista began a campaign of bullying that quickly escalated. She accused Colleen of trying to steal Tadaro. When Colleen denied it, Krista called her a liar. Then she spread rumors, saying Colleen was promiscuous. When that didn't stick, she accused her of being racist. She even went so far as to convince Shadola, who was black, that Colleen hated her. Krista's manipulations turned many against Colleen, and soon, the once safe dorm became a nightmare. Colleen kept to herself. She didn't fight back, until one day she did. In front of witnesses, Colleen finally told Krista she wasn't interested in Tadaro, that he seemed like a nice guy, but he wasn't her type. The words were simple, but Krista twisted them into something else. She claimed Colleen had insulted Tadaro because he was black and used that to justify her hatred. Soon after, Colleen's room was trashed. Her belongings were stolen. Her money is gone. Krista denied doing it herself, but made sure people knew who was responsible. Colleen had enough. She reported Krista to Job Corps authorities. Krista was placed under investigation. One more infraction and she would be expelled. For Krista, it was all slipping away. Her boyfriend, her power, her control. She couldn't let that happen. Over the winter break, Krista vanished from the dorms. When she returned, she told friends she'd suffered a miscarriage. She had been pregnant with Tadaro's child, she claimed. The relationship between them had been strained, and the loss sent her into a darker spiral. But as January rolled around, Krista seemed to change. She smiled more. She said she wanted to start over. She waved at Colleen. She told people she wanted to make amends. Even Colleen seemed relieved. The bullying had stopped. On the night of January 12th, Krista approached Colleen and invited her to walk to Blockbuster to rent a movie. It seemed innocent enough. They laughed. They signed out together. Two more people joined them, Tadaro and Shadola. Colleen had no idea that she would never return. That night, January 12th, 1995, the four students walked together, laughing under the streetlights. Krista, Tadaro, Shadola, and Colleen headed toward Tyson Park. Krista said they'd stashed something near the greenhouse and invited Colleen along to retrieve it. They promised they'd hang out, maybe smoke, and just talk. Colleen agreed, likely hopeful that the truce was genuine. She had no reason to suspect what was coming. As they entered the wooded trail, everything grew quiet. The park was dark, isolated, and cold. This wasn't a shortcut to the video store. This was something else entirely. Kim, Krista's roommate, would later tell detectives that Krista had revealed her plan before leaving. She'd said she wanted to hurt Colleen, even kill her, just because she felt like it. Kim thought it was just talk. She was wrong. Later that night, Krista returned to the dorm alone. Her pink sweater was gone. She seemed breathless, excited, and she carried something in her pocket, a piece of Colleen's skull. Krista told Kim everything, how she lured Colleen to the park, how they all surrounded her, how it started as a confrontation, then turned into something darker. Krista said she hit Colleen first. She slammed her head into her knee, threw her to the ground, and kicked her repeatedly. She hit her with a broken piece of asphalt. She mocked her. She laughed. She told Kim that Colleen begged for her life, over and over again, asking, "Why are you doing this to me?" But Krista didn't stop. She sliced Colleen with a box cutter. Then she used a meat cleaver. She said Tadaro held Colleen down while she kept cutting. When Colleen tried to run, they chased her, dragged her back. Krista described it all in detail. She didn't seem remorseful. She sang. She danced. She warned Kim, "Tell anyone and I'll kill you too." The next morning at breakfast, Krista tapped her jacket pocket and smiled. "I'm eating breakfast with it," she said. Krista couldn't stop talking about what she'd done. She showed another classmate the piece of skull. She pointed to the stains on her shoes. "That's not mud," she said. "That's blood." That student went straight to the police. Meanwhile, detectives were already reviewing the dorm sign-out sheet. They knew Colleen hadn't come back. They knew Krista, Tadaro, and Shadola were the last to see her. Now, with this new tip from a student, they had confirmation. Krista, Tadarel, and Shadola were brought in for questioning. The interviews didn't take long. None of them denied being there. Krista especially seemed eager to talk. She smiled. She described the attack in vivid detail, claiming she hadn't planned to kill Colleen, even though several people had already said otherwise. When asked why she brought weapons with her, she admitted to having a box cutter and a small meat cleaver. She refused to say who gave her the cleaver. Detectives suspected it came from one of the culinary students. She claimed the group told Colleen they had hidden marijuana in the park and invited her to smoke. When they reached the woods, she said things escalated. She hit Colleen, then kicked her, then dragged her. Krista said Colleen begged, promised not to tell, and cried for help, but she kept attacking. When Colleen tried to run, someone, likely Tadarel, tackled her. Then she slashed her again, over and over. She said she slit her throat 6 times. Then she cut out a piece of her skull. Then she carved the pentagram. Tadarel was different. He was quiet, sullen. He wore a pentagram necklace and admitted to carving half of the star into Colleen's chest. He said it wasn't a ritual. It wasn't planned. He just went along with it, but he had no explanation for why. He admitted to holding Colleen down, watching her beg, helping Krista. Shadola claimed she did nothing. She said she stood by, just watching. But she didn't help. She didn't run. She didn't tell anyone. She stayed silent until after the arrest, when she turned informant to avoid prison. The aftermath of Colleen Slemmer's murder sent deep shockwaves through both the Job Corps program and the broader Knoxville community. News of the killing spread quickly, and the details only worsened the sense of horror. Students were stunned. Many had shared dorm halls, classrooms, and even casual conversations with the individuals, now accused of committing something unthinkable. The idea that someone they ate meals with, joked with, or walked past in the hallway could be responsible for such a brutal act was overwhelming. The reaction wasn't limited to students. Teachers, administrators, and local residents were all shaken. Vigils were held. There was a strong sense of fear among the students, and many parents rushed to contact their children or even pull them out of the program. Staff members had to scramble to manage both the emotional needs of students and the media attention descending on the school. Colleen's family was devastated beyond words. Her mother, Mae Martinez, was shattered. She had spent the holidays with her daughter not long before and still carried vivid memories of their time together. The cheerful, bright-eyed girl who loved computers and was finally starting to come out of her shell had vanished, replaced by headlines and grief. The reality of her daughter's death and the way she died was almost too cruel to believe. For detectives, the path was clear. Swift justice was necessary, not only to hold the perpetrators accountable, but to reassure a terrified community. With confessions, physical evidence, witness accounts, and the suspects in custody, the wheels of justice began to move rapidly. The charges came down hard. Krista Pike was formally charged with first-degree murder. Due to the viciousness of the attack and clear evidence of premeditation, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. At just 18 years old, Krista became a central figure in one of Tennessee's most disturbing murder cases. The trial began in March of 1996. The courtroom was tense, crowded with reporters, concerned citizens, and grieving family members. As the case unfolded, the public got a full view into Krista's past, her disturbing behaviors, and the toxic relationship she shared with Tadarel Shipp. Jurors were shown graphic crime scene photos. They listened to recordings of Krista describing the murder in her own words, laughing and boasting. Witnesses testified to her manipulative behavior, her obsessions, and the casual way she had spoken about what she had done. There was no ambiguity. Krista had not only taken Colleen's life, she had enjoyed it. The court saw her not just as guilty, but as dangerous, unrepentant, and disturbingly proud. After 2 long months, the jury reached its decision. Krista Pike, was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge delivered the sentence, death by electrocution. At the time, she became the youngest woman on death row in the United States since 1972, and the only woman on death row in the state of Tennessee. The sentence made headlines across the country. While some felt justice had been served, others were uneasy. The idea of sentencing someone so young to death sparked debates, but not for May Martinez. To her, the punishment was too merciful. May believed that Krista deserved to feel even a fraction of the terror and pain her daughter experienced that night in Tyson Park. A quick death, she said, didn't match the horror of what had been done. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like a loophole. Tadaro Shipp, just 17 years old at the time of the murder, was also charged with first-degree murder. Though a minor, the severity of the crime led prosecutors to try him as an adult. During his trial, Tadaro did not deny his involvement. He admitted to holding Colleen down. He admitted to helping Krista, but he claimed he had been caught up in the moment, overwhelmed by Krista's dominance and manipulation. The jury wasn't swayed. Tadaro was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 25 years. These sentences would run consecutively. He will be eligible for parole in December 2026, a decision that continues to spark concern for those who believe his role was far more than passive. Shadola Peterson's path was different. She cooperated with investigators, offered testimony, and was given probation in exchange. While some understood the strategy, many were outraged. Shadola had been there. She had witnessed Colleen's suffering. She had a chance to intervene, to run, to tell someone. But she didn't. Her silence, many felt, was complicity. Time didn't dull the pain for May Martinez. Her daughter was gone, and each year that passed was a reminder of what was lost. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, they all passed with a shadow over them. May became an advocate. She pushed relentlessly for Krista's execution to be carried out. She attended every hearing, gave interviews, and made sure her daughter's name wasn't forgotten. For her, this wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice, about closure. Krista Pike remained on death row. Over the years, her attorneys filed multiple appeals. They argued that her mental health had never been properly addressed, that she had been isolated in solitary confinement for decades, a form of punishment they said was unconstitutional. In 2012, Krista was caught attempting to orchestrate an escape plan. She had connected with someone out of state and was planning to bribe a prison guard to help her flee. The plan failed, but it reminded the public that she was still dangerous, still willing to manipulate, and still seeking control. Even now, Krista's name is debated. Some argue she was a product of trauma, of a broken system that failed her. Others see her as a symbol of unchecked evil. Forums, podcasts, and legal panels continue to dissect the case. But one thing remains constant. For May Martinez, and for anyone who knew Colleen, the wound never healed. This story is often told through the lens of Krista Pike, but it should never be forgotten that the real story belongs to Colleen Slemmer. Colleen was just 17. She was curious, thoughtful, and bright. She had dreams. She loved technology and wanted to pursue a career in computers. She was kind, quiet, a young woman working hard for a better future. She went to Job Corps because she believed in bettering herself. She wanted to learn and succeed not just for herself, but for her family. She deserved to feel safe, to be supported, and to have her chance. Instead, she became the target of someone else's insecurity and anger. Her life was taken from her, piece by piece, on a cold night, in a place that should have been safe. Her final moments were filled with fear, pain, and betrayal. And yet, she never harmed anyone. She never fought back out of hate. She begged for mercy. That mercy never came. Remembering Colleen means remembering her life, not just her death. It means recognizing the signs of cruelty before they erupt. It means protecting those who are vulnerable. It means choosing kindness even when the world is dark. Colleen's story must not be lost in the noise. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a student, and a young woman full of light. Her name deserves to be spoken with care. That brings us to the end of Colleen Slemmer's story. A heartbreaking case of a young woman full of promise, taken by someone who should have never had the chance. May her memory remind us to protect the quiet ones and speak up when something feels wrong. Still with me? If you're enjoying this and want more, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. I share a new story every night. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps the secrets coming. Now, let's get into story 2. It was the final day of 2011 in Evans, Colorado, a small, quiet town nestled about an hour north of Denver. On the surface, it was like any other New Year's Eve. Streets were calm, lights shimmered in living room windows, and the soft thud of music and laughter echoed from house parties dotting the neighborhood. In one of those homes, a young couple was preparing to welcome the new year, surrounded by family and friends. For Ashley Fallis, 28, it was supposed to be a fresh start. The past year had been filled with challenges, but she was smiling that night, dancing, laughing, hosting a party with her husband, Tom, and their 3 young children. Ashley wasn't just a mother. She was a fighter. A respiratory therapist by profession, she balanced long shifts at a rehab hospital with the daily demands of raising 3 children, Madeline, Jolie, and little Blake. Anyone who knew her would tell you she was fiercely devoted to her family. Despite the strain and emotional fatigue that came with parenting a medically complex child, Blake had been diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a serious condition where fluid builds up in the brain. Ashley rarely showed signs of giving up. She was tough, focused. She took on Blake's condition with determination, even advocating before Congress to push for awareness and funding. But beneath that strength, the cracks in her marriage were beginning to show. Her relationship with Tom Fallis had started with promise. They had met in April of 2007. Tom was responsible and presented himself as someone ready to embrace the full weight of family life. Ashley, already raising 2 daughters from a previous marriage, found comfort in Tom's commitment. They moved quickly, too quickly, some said. Within months of meeting, Ashley was pregnant with their son, and 2 weeks after his birth, the couple married. Not everyone approved. Ashley's parents, Jenna and Joel, were uneasy about Tom. He came off as controlling, overly eager to be the dominant force in the relationship. He worked as a corrections officer for Weld County Sheriff's Office, a job that, to them, seemed perfectly suited to someone who thrived on control. Still, Ashley, who had always loved with intensity, chose to see the good in him. By the end of 2011, however, things were strained. Blake's health, the pressures of parenting, and Tom's personality had taken a toll. Ashley had reportedly spoken to her parents about divorce. Still, when the new year approached, she decided to keep the peace. She planned the party. Friends and family were invited, and despite suffering from what she believed was a miscarriage just hours earlier, she put on a brave face. They would ring in the new year surrounded by loved ones. As midnight approached, the atmosphere was light. Guests described Ashley as upbeat, smiling, and affectionate. She had even talked about hosting a Super Bowl party in the coming weeks. Whatever sadness she may have carried from earlier that day, she didn't let it show. But inside the home, not everything was calm. Witnesses recalled Tom growing agitated as the night wore on. He cursed loudly about fantasy football, petty, aggressive outbursts that embarrassed Ashley in front of her family. When Jenna asked him to tone it down for the kids' sake, he snapped. F*** those kids, he reportedly muttered. He said they always woke him up at night. The tension grew. Later he would explode in anger again, yelling at Ashley's family that he wished they would all die. Still, Ashley walked her parents out around 12:48 a.m. She hugged them, smiled, kissed them goodbye. She stood on the porch waving as they pulled away, still talking about that Super Bowl party. According to her mother, she didn't seem upset. This wasn't out of the ordinary. Tom's behavior sadly had become familiar. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. It was 12:50 a.m. Tom was screaming on the other end of the line. "You are not leaving me. You are staying here," he cried into the 911 dispatcher's ear. His voice was frantic. He said his wife had just shot herself in the head. Just minutes earlier, she was smiling. Now, she was bleeding out in the bedroom. Jenna and Joel hadn't even gotten far. They had pulled over with Ashley's uncle to discuss the disturbing behavior they had witnessed at the party. As they sat parked, an emergency vehicle sped past them in the opposite direction, heading straight for Ashley's house. Something was very wrong. That was only the beginning. By the time Jenna and Joel returned to Ashley's house, red and blue lights painted the neighborhood. Squad cars and an ambulance were already there. The quiet street had become a flurry of chaos, and at the center of it all was Tom, pacing the porch, yelling, his shirt soaked in blood. But Ashley was nowhere to be seen. What had happened inside that house after they pulled away? Minutes earlier, their daughter was smiling and waving goodbye. Now, officers were roping off the scene with yellow tape, and paramedics were rushing inside. Jenna and Joel were not allowed in. They stood back, helpless, their worst fears starting to settle in their chests like concrete. Something terrible had happened, and they could only guess what it was. Their daughter, always a light in the room, the one holding it together for her children, was inside, injured, or worse. Ashley's 9-year-old daughter, desperate and terrified, had sent a series of emails to Joel just after the 911 call. One message at 12:51 a.m. simply read, "Help." Another followed a minute later, "Come here, help." Then came the final message, chilling in its clarity. She got shot. The children had been in the house. They had heard everything. Ashley was taken to the hospital with catastrophic injuries. The doctors tried, but the damage was too severe. At 3:44 a.m., she was pronounced dead. The cause? A single gunshot wound to the head. The police began questioning Tom. His shirt was still stained with Ashley's blood. He looked shaken, but was composed enough to give them his version of events. According to him, Ashley had come into their bedroom angry. She told him she was going to do whatever she wanted, smoke if she wanted to, live the way she pleased. Then, while he was in the closet changing his clothes, he heard a click. When he came out, he said she was crouched on the floor beside the bed where she kept a 9mm handgun. Before he could react, she fired. He claimed it happened in seconds. He said he rushed to her side, cradled her head, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. The dispatcher recorded him sobbing, screaming, begging her not to leave him. But the pieces didn't fit. Neighbors had heard screaming from the house. One, Chelsea Erico, lived just behind them. She said she could hear a man shouting, "Your effing mom! Answer my question!" Then she heard a woman yell, "Get off me!" Ashley had bruises on her legs, fresh ones. Tom had scratches across his chest. He said they came from shaving. His first time doing so, he claimed, which had irritated his skin. That explanation didn't sit right with anyone. DNA tests later confirmed Ashley's DNA was under Tom's fingernails. The children, questioned briefly by police, reported hearing yelling from their parents' bedroom. One of the girls, Jolie, said she heard Daddy getting the gun ready and heard him shoot her mother, but she hadn't seen it, just heard it, and the bedroom door was closed. Her statement was dismissed as unreliable. Still, the signs were all there: a struggle, a fight, witnesses, and a family who refused to believe that Ashley, a devoted mother who had just been hugging her parents goodbye, would end her own life. What really stood out to investigators were the items scattered around the bedroom. Pictures had been knocked from the wall. A flashlight lay oddly near Ashley's body, out of place. Divorce papers sat openly on the dresser, an unmistakable reminder of the tension brewing in the marriage. Tom didn't mention any of this in his version of events. Despite all this, he was not arrested. In fact, the coroner ruled Ashley's death a suicide just 1 week later, on January 7th, 2012, before all forensic results were even in. 2 months later, the case was officially closed. Ashley's parents were stunned. Their daughter, a woman who had stood in front of Congress to fight for her son's health care, who smiled through pain, who made plans for a Super Bowl party, had her death written off as something she chose. But they never believed it, not for a second, and they weren't alone. Jenna and Joel tried to move on, but how could they? They buried their daughter, not just with heartbreak, but with questions. Heavy questions. Did she suffer? What did her last moments look like? Why had the case been closed so quickly? Why did everything feel unfinished? They clung to Ashley's children, now living with Tom in Indiana. Despite everything, Jenna and Joel kept contact for the kids' sake. The girls and Blake were all they had left of Ashley, and they didn't want them to lose more than they already had. Behind the grief, though, was anger, burning. Ashley had been strong, vibrant, focused on her children. She wasn't a woman who gave up, certainly not on them. But Weld County's conclusion didn't match that truth. The county coroner listed Ashley's death as suicide. The police accepted Tom's story without checking some of the most basic details. They didn't properly follow up with the neighbors. They didn't re-interview Chelsea Errico, the one who said she heard Ashley scream, "Get off me!" No phone records were pulled to confirm Kathy Glover's account of a call she received from Chelsea saying, "Tom shot his wife." The children's stories were dismissed, and one neighbor's testimony was completely altered in the police report. It didn't feel like incompetence. It felt like something more deliberate. After all, Tom wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a corrections officer. He was one of them. Ashley's family believed there was a cover-up. Still, for 2 years, nothing changed. Until a reporter got involved. Justin Joseph was a journalist. One of his sources in law enforcement tipped him off. Something about Ashley's case didn't sit right. He started digging, talking to neighbors, comparing statements, reading through what few documents were available. That's when everything started to unravel. 15-year-old Nick Glover, who lived next door to Tom and Ashley at the time, told Justin that on the night of Ashley's death, he and his family had crouched by the window, watching Tom outside with his parents. Nick swore he saw Tom walk up to them and say over and over, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did it. I shot her." Nick said he told an officer that night, Officer Michael Yates. He even gave a full statement, but in the official report, Yates claimed Nick never said that. Instead, he wrote that Chelsea, the neighbor who said she heard fighting, told another neighbor Tom's wife shot herself. The problem? That neighbor, Kathy Glover, remembered the conversation. She said Chelsea told her Tom shot Ashley. The details were being twisted. Justin kept digging, and the more he uncovered, the more disturbing it became. A second officer, Chris Graves, a Weld County Sheriff's deputy, also came forward. He admitted he heard Tom say, "I shot her. I can't believe she's dead." But Graves never reported it. He said it wasn't his case. That confession had sat unreported for 2 years. How many people had seen or heard something? How many were ignored or silenced? Armed with these findings, Justin ran the story. And just like that, the case reopened. But not by Weld County, not this time. It was handed off to a neighboring agency in Fort Collins, a department not connected to Tom. A fresh set of eyes, a new investigation, and finally hope. Hope for truth, hope for accountability, and most of all, hope that Ashley's voice, silenced that night, might finally be heard again. The reinvestigation started with urgency, but caution. Fort Collins police knew they were stepping into a mess. A case long declared closed, a suspect who had walked free, a grieving family that had already been let down once, and a community questioning how far loyalty among law enforcement would go. But they began the right way, from scratch. They combed through photos from the scene. They reviewed autopsy findings. They interviewed witnesses again, some of whom hadn't been properly questioned the first time. Others, whose statements had been ignored or misrepresented, were given a second chance to speak. They revisited the neighbors. Chelsea Errico, the young woman who had lived behind Tom and Ashley, told Fort Collins investigators that she had heard arguing that night. A man shouting angrily, a woman screaming, "Get off me!" But when pressed in court years later, she said she couldn't remember the call she placed to Kathy Glover, or even if she placed it. Chelsea admitted she'd been drinking that night. Her memory, she said, was fuzzy, not reliable. That uncertainty was a blow. Her statement had once seemed powerful. Now it became another maybe. But Nick Glover remained clear. He hadn't wavered once in 2 years. He remembered Tom's exact words. He remembered hiding at the window. He remembered watching Tom repeat himself, "I shot her. I can't believe I did it." Nick's mother backed him up, and their phone records showed a call to Chelsea's number at 1 o'clock a.m., just minutes after the 911 call from Tom. That call proved Chelsea said something. It might not confirm the exact words, but it proved Kathy hadn't made it up. Then, there was Officer Chris Graves. His statement confirmed what Nick said he'd heard. But why had Graves waited 2 years to say anything? Why hadn't he told his supervisor? Why hadn't he written a report? Graves said it wasn't his case, that he didn't know it would matter, but it did. All of it did. The reinvestigation team also took a hard look at the physical evidence. Ashley had a gunshot wound to the back right of her head. Her arms didn't show signs of residue. The bruises on her legs suggested a struggle, like she'd been knocked down. A heavy flashlight was found near her body, oddly out of place. Photos of the room showed framed pictures knocked off the walls. The bedroom looked like there had been a fight. Tom had scratches on his torso. He said they were from shaving his chest. A flimsy explanation, but not impossible. And then, of course, there were the divorce papers, sitting in plain view, documents that Ashley had placed on the dresser, possibly a signal, a final stand. To investigators, it painted a clear picture of a volatile relationship, one full of control, intimidation, and now violence. They turned to a forensic animator, Scott Roeder, who recreated the scene using measurements, ballistic evidence, and Tom's own version of events. The result? 2 possible scenarios, equal in probability. It could have been suicide. It could have been murder. A perfect 50-50ths. It wasn't enough to prove Tom killed Ashley, but it certainly wasn't enough to believe he didn't. And it shattered Weld County's original assumption that this had been an open and shut case. That assumption had been reckless. It had cost the case years, and it had cost Ashley's family any shot at peace. But the new evidence gave prosecutors what they needed, a reason to act. In November 2014, a grand jury indicted Tom Fallis for the murder of his wife. He was arrested in Indiana, where he'd been living with Ashley's children. Years after walking away untouched, he was finally charged. But nothing would come easy. Not for Jenna and Joel. Not for the kids. And certainly not for a jury that would soon be asked to decide whether Ashley Fallis had taken her own life, or if her husband had stolen it from her. Tom Fallis stood before a judge in the spring of 2016, no longer a corrections officer, no longer the grieving husband portrayed in the news. He was now the accused, a man charged with murdering his wife just 10 minutes after she waved goodbye to her parents on New Year's Eve. The courtroom was tense. On one side sat Jenna and Joel, Ashley's parents, heartbroken but determined. They had spent 4 years fighting to get here, 4 years challenging a system that had declared their daughter's death self-inflicted. On the other side, Tom's parents sat behind him. His children, now older, were in Indiana, cared for by his family. Tom pleaded not guilty. His defense team didn't waste time. They laid out their case early. Ashley Fallis was troubled. She suffered from anxiety and depression. She had just experienced a miscarriage. She had gone off her medication. She drank heavily the night she died. All of it, they argued, had created a perfect storm. They claimed that Ashley had taken her own life in a split-second moment of emotional collapse. They produced 2 letters, one typed, one handwritten, that they said Ashley had left behind. The first was addressed to Tom, apologizing for the pain she caused and saying she didn't even like her children anymore. The second was shorter. In it, Ashley claimed to be broken. "I've done all I can," she wrote, but the timing was suspicious. Tom hadn't mentioned either letter in the initial investigation or even in the years that followed. He brought them forward only after the case was reopened. Jenna didn't believe the letters were authentic, not for a second. She had spoken to her daughter just 10 minutes before the 911 call. Ashley had been planning a Super Bowl party. She was smiling, hugging, waving from the porch. She was fine, Jenna said on the stand. Not depressed, not suicidal, just overwhelmed, like any mother of 3 would be. She described the tension between Ashley and Tom, how Tom would explode over small things, how he needed control, how, despite the volatility, Ashley had always pushed forward, especially for her son Blake, who lived with a serious medical condition. She didn't give up, Jenna said. She advocated for Blake in front of Congress. That's not someone who gives up. The prosecution called their own witnesses. Nick Glover, just 15 at the time, testified that he had seen Tom outside the house shortly after the gunshot, that he heard Tom say to his parents, "I shot her. I can't believe I did it." His story was consistent. His mother, Kathy, testified that she received a call from their neighbor, Chelsea, right after the shooting. Kathy said Chelsea told her, "Tom shot Ashley." But on the stand, Chelsea backtracked. She didn't remember the call. She admitted she'd been drinking. She didn't recall hearing anyone say, "Get off me." The jury watched as a potential star witness faded into uncertainty. Then came Chris Graves, the deputy who said or had also heard Tom confess at the scene. He claimed Tom shouted, "I can't believe I shot her. I can't believe she's dead." But Graves admitted he never wrote it down. He never reported it to a supervisor. He said it wasn't his case. The defense pounced on that. "Why wait 2 years?" they asked. "Why now?" Graves had no strong answer. His delay gave the defense a crucial opening. Doubt. Then came the experts. One prosecution expert said Ashley's wound was consistent with homicide. He believed she and Tom had been struggling over the gun. But another, called by the defense, said the angle of the wound could just as easily suggest suicide. He pointed to her mental health history, her medication changes, her family history, 2 relatives who had died by suicide. He said those factors couldn't be ignored. Then came Scott Roeder, the forensic animator. His analysis was sobering. The evidence, he said, gave equal weight to both theories. Suicide was possible. Murder was possible. It was a 50-50th case, and that was a problem. To convict Tom Fallis, the jury had to be sure, beyond a reasonable doubt, not 50-50ths, not 60-40ths. They needed 100% certainty. After just 3.5 hours of deliberation, they returned to the courtroom. Tom Fallis was found not guilty. Jenna and Joel sat in a stunned silence. Tom wept. The case was closed. Again. The not guilty verdict didn't end the story. It fractured it. Tom Fallis walked out of court a free man. He had faced the weight of a murder charge, endured a national spotlight, and ultimately walked away. But for Ashley's family, freedom for Tom felt like captivity for them. A sentence of unanswered questions, unresolved grief, and a justice system that had slipped out through their fingers. Jenna sat in her car after the verdict and cried. Not the kind of cry that comes with sadness alone, but the kind that bubbles out from rage, helplessness, and pure exhaustion. Her daughter was gone, and in her mind, the person responsible had walked away twice. That night, she couldn't sleep. Neither could Joel. They went through every conversation they had with Ashley during those final weeks. They reread text messages, replayed voicemails. They studied photographs from that New Year's Eve party like detectives. She was glowing, Jenna whispered one night, flipping through an album. She was laughing. And she was planning a Super Bowl party, planning to follow up with her doctor, planning to keep pushing forward with her work in hydrocephalus awareness. People who are finished with life don't make plans. Ashley's 3 children stayed in Indiana under the care of Tom's parents. Jenna and Joel tried to stay involved, calling, visiting, writing letters, but every interaction was complicated. How do you speak about your daughter when the man raising her children is the man you believe took her life? So they focused on memory. They built a foundation in Ashley's name. They spoke at schools, parent groups, domestic violence forums. Even though Ashley had never reported abuse, Jenna believed her daughter had been silenced long before she was shot. Not with threats, but with isolation, with control. She wasn't allowed to breathe, Jenna said in one interview. She wasn't allowed to just be. The house in Evans, Colorado, where Ashley died, eventually went up for sale. Joel couldn't drive past it. Jenna wouldn't even look at it in photos. They heard rumors that new buyers didn't even know a woman had died in the master bedroom. Legally, the disclosure wasn't required. Still, to Jenna, it felt like the world had buried Ashley twice. Tom returned to life quietly. The media cycle faded. He pursued graduate school. He raised the children. He didn't speak publicly about the case, and his parents declined interviews. But to Ashley's family and friends, his silence spoke volumes. Jenna and Joel kept a box in their closet. Inside were photos, birthday cards, Ashley's hairbrush, and a small stuffed bear that still carried the scent of her old perfume. It wasn't much, but it was all they had left. They still talked to her. At Christmas, Jenna lights a candle. On Ashley's birthday, Joel plays her favorite song. And every New Year's Eve, at 12:48 a.m., the minute Ashley waved goodbye for the last time, they sit by the window, waiting, watching, wondering. The justice system is built on 2 pillars, truth and process. But for Ashley Fallis, her family, and the people who loved her, both pillars cracked under the weight of missed steps and decisions made too fast. When Ashley died, her case should have sparked a thorough and balanced investigation. Instead, what happened in those first 24 hours shaped the next 10 years. From the beginning, Tom Fallis told police his wife had shot herself. Officers on scene seemed to accept that. There was no gunshot residue test performed on Tom, no detailed interviews of neighbors, no forensic review of the flashlight lying near Ashley's body. The children inside the house weren't formally interviewed by specialists, and the neighbor who claimed to hear Ashley scream, "Get off me," was never brought back in for follow-up critical gaps, permanent consequences. The coroner ruled Ashley's death a suicide just days after it happened, before forensic results came in. That ruling didn't just end the investigation, it changed the way everyone looked at the case. Prosecutors closed it, officers moved on, evidence degraded. Jenna and Joel felt the door slam shut. They weren't just grieving their daughter, they were fighting a system that seemed determined to look the other way. They weren't alone. A reporter, Justin Joseph, was the first outside voice to seriously question the official story. He talked to neighbors, re-examined timelines, discovered contradictions in police notes, and, most importantly, he found people whose statements had been dismissed or edited. A teenager named Nick Glover said he saw Tom walk outside after the shooting and confess to his parents. "I shot her." He swore by it. He gave a statement to police. But the report filed by the officer who took his statement, Michael Yates, didn't mention it. That same officer claimed he never heard anything about a confession. And yet another officer, a sheriff's deputy, later said he too had heard Tom admit to shooting Ashley. But that admission didn't show up in reports either. It was mistake layered on mistake. In the courtroom, the defense used every misstep to their advantage. Witness memories faded over time. Phone calls weren't recorded. Forensic evidence was missing or inconclusive. Some officers claimed no wrongdoing. Others simply said, "It wasn't my case." That's the problem. When no one takes responsibility, no one is held accountable. The result? A case where everything pointed to foul play. Bruises, shouting, broken photo frames, a flashlight on the floor, a locked bedroom door, divorce papers, bloody bed sheets, but nothing legally stuck. The jury couldn't convict Tom Fallis, not because they believed he was innocent, but because they couldn't prove he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The justice system worked exactly as it was designed, but that didn't make it right. Jenna and Joel knew the trial wouldn't bring Ashley back, but they hoped it would give her a voice, that someone would say out loud, under oath, what they had believed all along, that Ashley didn't end her life, that someone else did. Instead, the courtroom became another space where Ashley was silenced, not by gunfire, but by doubt. In the chaos of loss and the confusion of a failed justice process, 3 young lives were forever altered. Ashley Fallis's children, Madeline, Jolie, and Blake, weren't just witnesses to their mother's death. They were survivors of its fallout. The night their world shifted, they had been in the house. Close enough to hear the shouting, close enough to feel something was wrong, close enough that Jolie, only 6 years old, made a statement to police that she had heard her father get the gun ready and that he shot mommy. But that statement, like so many others, was never formally followed up or considered reliable. Officers said she was too young, that she hadn't seen it happen, that children confuse things. But for Jenna and Joel, those words were a scream for truth. After Ashley's death, Tom Fallis took the children and moved them to Indiana. He had adopted Madeline and Jolie after marrying Ashley, so he had full parental rights. There was no legal barrier. One day, Jenna and Joel had been grandparents living close. The next, they were a plane ride away from the only pieces of Ashley they had left. It was a second loss. They knew if they wanted to stay in their grandchildren's lives, they would have to stay in contact with Tom. That meant playing civil, swallowing rage, smiling through heartbreak. They hated him, but they loved those children more. And that love forced them into an unthinkable position, negotiating holidays, visits, and calls with the man they believed had taken their daughter's life. There were birthday parties where the air felt like glass, school events with tight smiles and tense silence. Every visit, a reminder of what had been taken and what still had to be protected. Over time, the children grew. Questions surfaced. Why did their mother die? What really happened that night? Jenna and Joel never forced their version of the story on the kids. They gave them space. They answered when asked. And they always reminded them who Ashley had been. Her laugh, her stubbornness, her love for life and for them. Ashley had once stood in front of Congress to advocate for Blake's medical condition. She had fought for resources, for visibility, for progress. She wasn't someone who gave up. She was someone who leaned in, even when the odds were stacked against her. Jenna wanted the kids to remember that version of their mother, not the one reduced to a court document or a disputed statement. Years later, Blake's condition improved. The surgeries became less frequent. The medical chaos gave way to teenage routines. But the shadow of that night never truly left. Not for the children, not for the grandparents, not for anyone who had loved Ashley Fallis. The children still live with their father. They still carry his name, but they also carry Ashley's legacy. Jenna and Joel don't know what the kids will come to believe as they grow older, but they do know one thing. They won't stop telling Ashley's story, quietly, gently, consistently, Because while the system failed to prove what happened, the truth still breathes through memory. It lives in Ashley's children. Years passed, but the name Ashley Fallis never truly left the public eye. At least, not for those who had followed the case from the beginning. In Evans, Colorado, her death was once whispered about in church pews, gas station lines, and parent groups. But the whispers never settled. They lingered. They grew. This wasn't just a tragic death. It was a case that refused to stay buried. At first, people accepted the official story. A young mother, overwhelmed, emotionally drained, had taken her own life. The authorities said so. The coroner ruled it suicide. The case was closed within days. But not everyone could sleep at night with that version of events, especially not her mother, Jenna Fox. Jenna had lived through Ashley's entire life, from her first breath to her final words. And nothing, not a single cell in her body, believed that Ashley had chosen to leave her children, her family, and everything she'd worked so hard to build. Jenna wasn't alone in her disbelief. Friends, neighbors, even strangers who'd heard the story began to question the timeline, the inconsistencies, and most of all, how quickly it had all been wrapped up. Tom Fallis had been a corrections officer, a man with ties to law enforcement. Some believed that connection had shielded him, that doors had been quietly closed to protect one of their own. But it wouldn't stay quiet forever. 2 years after Ashley's death, a reporter named Justin Joseph reopened the wound. He received a call from a source inside law enforcement, someone who believed what many were starting to suspect, that Ashley Fallis hadn't taken her own life, but had been killed, and that someone had covered it up. Justin dug in. He started from the ground up, interviews, police reports, neighborhood accounts. And the more he investigated, the more cracks he found in the official narrative. One of the biggest revelations came from a neighbor named Nick Glover. He was just 15 at the time of Ashley's death, but in 2014, he came forward and said he had seen something that night, something big. Nick told Justin he had watched Tom Fallis outside his house, talking to his parents. "I can't believe I did it," Tom had said, repeatedly, until, according to Nick, his parents asked him what he was talking about, and Tom replied, "I shot her." That wasn't all. A deputy, Chris Graves, also said he heard Tom confess at the scene, but he never documented it, never told a superior. He claimed it wasn't his case, that he didn't think it was relevant, but it was. It was everything. When these revelations surfaced, the case was reopened. A fresh investigation began, not by Evans PD, but by a neighboring, more experienced department. Fort Collins took over, and with them came new eyes, new questions, and new pressure. Tom Fallis, who had moved to Indiana and tried to rebuild his life, suddenly found himself back under a microscope. He refused interviews, denied any wrongdoing, but the walls were closing in. In November 2014, nearly 3 years after Ashley's death, Tom was indicted for her murder. To Jenna and Joel, it felt like hope, like the truth was finally pushing its way through the noise. But indictments are not convictions, and what followed would test every ounce of their strength. Because even reopened, even reinvestigated, Ashley's case would prove difficult. Time had passed. Evidence had been mishandled. Witnesses' memories had faded. And in the gaps left by a botched original investigation, reasonable doubt crept in. The case wasn't going away, but neither was the damage that had already been done. In March of 2016, the courtroom was packed. Some came for answers, others came for justice. A few just came to watch. Tom Fallis sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. For years, he had insisted he had nothing to do with Ashley's death. Now, with a murder charge hanging over his head, he'd have to convince a jury of that same story, without a shred of doubt. The prosecution laid out their case with quiet precision. They didn't have a smoking gun, not anymore, but they had pieces, bruises on Ashley's legs, scratches on Tom's chest, neighbors who heard yelling, divorce papers on the dresser, and witnesses, at least two, who claimed Tom admitted to the shooting. It wasn't an open and shut case, but it wasn't baseless either. Then came the surprise. 2 handwritten notes and a typed letter, supposedly written by Ashley before her death. Letters that painted her as broken, apologetic, ready to give up. But here's the problem. Those letters had never been seen before. Not by police, not by family, not by the coroner. For more than 2 years, Tom had kept them to himself. Now, at trial, he presented them as proof that Ashley had taken her own life. Jenna and Joel were stunned. This wasn't Ashley's voice. Not the woman who had stood before Congress. Not the mother who'd thrown a New Year's party hours before her death. Not the daughter who had waved goodbye out on the porch at 12:48 a.m., smiling, hugging, talking about hosting a Super Bowl party. It didn't add up. The defense argued that Ashley's miscarriage that day, her decision to stop taking anxiety medication, and her family history of suicide all pointed toward mental instability, that she had acted on impulse in a moment of darkness. They said the party didn't matter, the hugs didn't matter, the planning didn't matter. But to Ashley's family, it all mattered. Every moment, every look, every word. They had seen her that night, alive, energetic, engaged. She didn't look like someone giving up. Still, the defense had one more angle: doubt. That's all they needed, not proof that Tom was innocent, just proof that maybe, possibly, he wasn't guilty. And unfortunately, the original investigation had handed them just that. The Evans Police Department had fumbled the case from the beginning. They didn't properly interview key witnesses. They failed to preserve physical evidence. They didn't test Tom's hands for gunshot residue. And perhaps worst of all, they closed the case before all forensic results were in. They treated it as a suicide from the jump, and then tried to build the story around that conclusion. The jury was forced to make a decision not on emotion, not even on gut instinct, but on what could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt with the evidence available. After just 3.5 hours of deliberation, they returned with their verdict: not guilty. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Jenna collapsed into tears. Joel's face tightened with disbelief. Tom stood still, absorbing the words. Acquitted. To the court, Tom Fallis was a free man. To Ashley's family, he had gotten away with murder. And the letters, those last-minute, conveniently timed letters, left a bitter taste that would never fade. The courtroom emptied out slowly. Reporters scribbled, cameras rolled. The buzz of the verdict echoed far beyond the courthouse walls. But for Ashley's parents, Jenna and Joel, it wasn't just a headline. It was a sentence. A life sentence of wondering, questioning, grieving, without answers. They walked out that day knowing two things. Ashley was gone, and the person they believed responsible was walking free. Tom Fallis had been acquitted. He was legally innocent, but in the hearts of those who knew Ashley best, he had never been more guilty. The days that followed felt like a second funeral. Old wounds reopened. Friends, relatives, even strangers reached out to Jenna and Joel, sharing memories, offering support, expressing disbelief. But none of it brought peace. The verdict had sent a message, one that Ashley's family couldn't ignore. The system had failed. In Evans, Colorado, where the shooting happened, some residents breathed a sigh of relief. Others shook their heads. Small towns remembered things, and many people still remembered that New Year's night in 2011, when they saw ambulances screaming toward the Fallis home, just minutes after Ashley had waved goodbye to her parents. Some of those same people still believed the story never added up. Back in Indiana, Tom resumed his life with the children. He had left Colorado shortly after Ashley's death, enrolled in graduate school, and built a routine. The trial had interrupted that. Now, with the case behind him, he returned to it, but not without scrutiny. The story had gone national. Interviews, podcasts, documentaries. It became part of true crime canon. Everyone had an opinion. The court had its verdict, but the public had its own version of justice. And Tom Fallis remained a subject of fascination and suspicion. For Ashley's children, Madeline, Jolie, and Blake, the confusion ran even deeper. They had been young the night it happened, too young to fully understand, but old enough to remember. Blake was only 4, Jolie 6, Madeline 9. They had seen things, heard things, felt things. They had lost their mother in the space of 10 chaotic minutes. Now they were living with the man accused and acquitted of causing it. Jenna and Joel continued to visit the kids. They kept it civil with Tom. They had no choice. If they wanted to stay in the children's lives, they couldn't afford confrontation. But it was never easy. Every visit, every call, every birthday, they were reminded of the gap Ashley left behind, and the truth that no courtroom verdict could erase. She should still be here. The legal system had closed the case, but the grief never closed. And for Jenna and Joel, the mission wasn't over. They couldn't change the verdict, but they could fight for memory. They could tell the world who Ashley really was. Not a headline, not a case number, not a tragic statistic. A mother, a daughter, a friend. Before the headlines, before the 911 call, before the arguments and the accusations and the funeral. Ashley Fallis was just Ashley. A daughter, a mother, a friend, a force. She wasn't perfect, but she was present, fiercely alive, unapologetically herself. And to those who knew her best, she was unforgettable. Ashley was born on January 1st, 1984, in Colorado. Her mother, Jenna Fox, called her a New Year's baby with a fire in her soul. From the beginning, Ashley had a spark, a laugh that filled a room, a quick wit, and a stubborn streak that could hold its own against anyone. She grew up in a close-knit family. Her mother and adoptive father, Joel, gave her a home full of structure and love. They weren't rich, but they were steady. Jenna and Ashley were especially close, best friends. They talked about everything. They shared inside jokes, movie nights, long drives. Jenna was Ashley's maid of honor at her wedding. That's how close they were. Ashley was a fighter in more ways than one. She struggled at times, financially, emotionally, but she didn't quit. She worked hard. She raised her kids with intention and energy. She was a respiratory therapist, caring for patients who couldn't breathe. She'd come home late, tired, but still managed to make her daughters laugh before bedtime. She wasn't the kind of mom who just went through the motions. She threw birthday parties. She made crafts. She stayed up late when one of the kids had a fever, and when her youngest son, Blake, was diagnosed with hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the brain. Ashley didn't fall apart. She became a warrior. She researched. She learned everything she could. She joined advocacy groups. Eventually, she led the Colorado chapter of the Pediatric Hydrocephalus Foundation. She even stood before Congress in Washington, D.C., testifying for increased research funding. That's who Ashley was. Someone who faced hard things with action. She didn't fold. She rose. Her relationship history wasn't simple. She married young and had 2 daughters, Madeline and Jolie, with her high school sweetheart. But the marriage didn't last. It was hard. 2 young people raising 2 kids, it wore them down. They divorced. But Ashley never regretted becoming a mother. Her daughters were her purpose. Then came Tom Fallis. She met him in 2007. He was a corrections officer, confident, assertive, sometimes too much so. Ashley fell fast, maybe too fast. Within months, she was pregnant again. They married quickly. Tom adopted Madeline and Jolie. They had Blake. From the outside, it looked like a complete family. But Ashley's parents weren't convinced. They saw something else. Control, arguments, possessiveness. Ashley didn't always admit it, but those closest to her noticed the change. Her spark dimmed a little. She laughed less. She looked tired. Still, she tried. She held the family together. She kept her kids protected, kept the home running. When things got hard, she didn't give up. She sought help. Counseling, medication. She wanted to be better, feel better, live better. And she didn't give up on her marriage easily. She wanted it to work, for the kids, for herself. But by late 2011, it was breaking. She was talking about divorce. The relationship had grown toxic. She was scared, overwhelmed. But she was still making plans. New Year's Eve was supposed to be a turning point, a night to celebrate, a chance to reset. She danced that night. She laughed with her parents. She hugged her kids. And then, minutes later, she was gone. That's the version the court never fully captured. That's the version the headlines glossed over. Ashley Fallis was not just a case. She was a whole person, one who lived, who loved, who mattered. And this chapter and the next and every chapter after is about holding on to that truth. December 31st, 2011. New Year's Eve in Evans, Colorado. For most people, it was a night of champagne, countdowns, and resolutions. But in the Fallis household, it was something more. A full house, laughter, kids running around in socks, family crammed into every room. 15 to 20 people in all, friends, relatives, loved ones, all gathered to ring in the new year. Ashley, 28, was glowing. Not in a dramatic, camera-ready way, in a real way. She was smiling, dancing barefoot in the living room, passing around food, laughing. She had just told her mom she wanted to host a Super Bowl party. That was weeks away. She was already thinking ahead, planning, dreaming. It wasn't a perfect night, though. There were cracks. Tom, her husband, was on edge. That wasn't unusual, but this time it showed. He got loud, started cursing, got into it about fantasy football. Jenna, Ashley's mom, asked him to quiet down. The kids were nearby. Tom snapped, F*** those kids, he said. Then louder, I wish you all would die. It wasn't said in a whisper. It wasn't private. Everyone heard it. He stormed off, slammed the door. Tension hung in the air like smoke. But Ashley, always the peacemaker, tried to keep it normal. When her parents got ready to leave, she walked them outside, kissed them goodbye, told them again about her Super Bowl plans. Hope you can come, she said, waving from the porch. Her last words to them. That was at 12:48 a.m. By 12:50, a 911 call was placed. 2 minutes, 2 minutes. According to Tom, Ashley had walked into the bedroom. She was upset. They argued. She told him she'd do whatever she wanted, that she'd get high if she wanted to. Then, he claimed, she grabbed the 9mm handgun she kept under the mattress, knelt by the bed, and shot herself in the head. He told the dispatcher, she shot herself. She's not leaving me. You're not leaving me. He was sobbing, screaming. But even in chaos, the details mattered. And the details didn't line up. Ashley had been cheerful minutes before, waving goodbye, talking about the future. No one saw this coming. The kids were still in the house. Their oldest daughter, only 9, started sending frantic emails to her grandparents. Help! Come here! She got shot! And outside, emergency vehicles were flying down the street, sirens blaring. Jenna and Joel had pulled over to talk on the side of the road. They had a feeling. Something was off. Then they saw the ambulances speeding past them, heading straight for the house they had just left. They turned around, fast. What they came back to was chaos. Ashley had been taken to the hospital. Tom was on the porch covered in blood, yelling. Officers had to threaten to use a taser just to calm him down. He insisted he was one of them. Weld County. He demanded specific officers respond. He didn't get to choose. The kids were inside, scared, crying. Ashley was in surgery. 1 gunshot wound to the head. No suicide note, no warning. Nothing that made sense. By 3:44 a.m., she was gone. Dead. A 28-year-old mother of 3 who had just been smiling on her porch hours earlier. The tragedy hit like a tidal wave, but for those who loved Ashley, something didn't sit right. The timing, the bruises, the argument, the history. None of it added up. And in the days that followed, the questions only grew louder. When officers arrived at the Fallis home that night, they weren't just responding to a gunshot wound. They were stepping into something messy, something that couldn't be smoothed over by a few shouted explanations or a teary 911 call. Tom said it was suicide, but the room said something else. Ashley had been found with a single gunshot wound to the head, near the back of her skull. The weapon, a 9mm Taurus, was supposedly hers, kept under the mattress for safety. Tom said she grabbed it while he was in the closet changing clothes. Said he heard the gun cock, heard a pop, ran to her, called for help. But the layout of the room, the position of her body, the bruises on her legs, the broken pictures that had fallen from the wall, none of it fit cleanly into that story. There was a large flashlight lying near Ashley's body, a heavy metal one, the kind you keep for emergencies. It was out of place, odd, there for no clear reason. Investigators couldn't explain why it was there. Tom never mentioned it. No one else had touched it. Ashley's legs were bruised, freshly. She hadn't fallen. She hadn't run into anything. And according to forensic experts, it looked like someone had struck her, possibly to force her down. There were scratches on Tom's torso. He said he'd shaved his chest for the first time and had scratched himself. But DNA found under Ashley's fingernails suggested something else. Struggle. Not only that, the framed pictures that usually hung on the bedroom wall had been knocked down. Divorce papers were sitting out on the dresser, front and center. They weren't hidden or folded away. They were right there, in plain sight, like a message, like a motive. Tom never mentioned the argument that had exploded minutes before. Never explained why so many guests at the party heard him screaming and cursing. Never offered details about the last moments his wife was seen alive, standing on the porch, planning a Super Bowl party. A neighbor, Chelsea, told police she heard yelling that night. Heard a man shouting, "Your Fing Mom, answer my Fing question." She said she heard a woman scream, "Get off me!" But her statement didn't make it into any official report. Later, she couldn't even recall the call she made to another neighbor. A second neighbor, Nick Glover, just 15 years old at the time, said he watched from behind a window and saw Tom come out of the house. He said Tom approached his own parents, frantic, repeating over and over, "I can't believe I did it. I shot her." Nick's statement was reportedly given to Officer Michael Yates that same night. But somehow, in Yates' report, it never appeared. The story was altered. It read as if someone else, Ashley, had shot herself. No mention of Tom's alleged confession. Years later, Yates denied that Nick ever told him anything like that. Denied that Kathy Glover, Nick's mom, had relayed Chelsea's phone call accurately. And that's when the whispers of a cover-up began. Tom wasn't just any man. He worked in law enforcement, a corrections officer, Weld County, the same agency some of the responding officers were tied to. Ashley's family, Jenna and Joel, weren't naive. They saw it for what it was. The case was closed too quickly, before forensic testing was even done, before interviews were completed, before any real evidence was thoroughly processed. 7 days after Ashley's death, January 7th, 2012, it was ruled a suicide. Case closed. But not for Jenna and Joel. Not for the people who knew Ashley best. They knew what she'd been through. They knew what she was capable of. They had watched her speak before Congress, lead a health foundation, fight for her son's life and well-being. They had never seen a woman more determined, more stubborn, more full of purpose. She didn't kill herself, and they weren't going to let that lie become her legacy. When a case is ruled a suicide within days, without full forensic analysis, without interviewing all the witnesses, and without a complete autopsy report, one has to ask, who benefits? Ashley Fallis didn't. Her children didn't. Her parents didn't. But Tom Fallis? He got to walk free, with the kids, with the story shaped the way he wanted it, and a system behind him that either didn't care, or cared too much about protecting one of their own. It started small, subtle. Officer Michael Yates took Nick Glover's statement the night Ashley died. Nick said he'd heard Tom admit to shooting her, not just once, but 4 times. "I shot her. I can't believe I did it. But Yates' official report said nothing of the sort. It also rewrote what Kathy Glover had said. According to her, neighbor Chelsea had called and said, "Your neighbor just shot his wife." But in Yates' report, it was changed to, "Your neighbor just shot herself." A single word makes a world of difference. Kathy was stunned. That wasn't what she had said. It wasn't what she had heard. And now, 2 years later, she was finding out her words had been twisted. Meanwhile, Officer Yates stood by his report, claimed Nick never said what he said, claimed Kathy was misremembering. And then it got worse. Chelsea, the neighbor who heard the screaming, was never followed up with. No second interview, no clarifying questions. Despite her initial claim of hearing Ashley yell, "Get off me!" no one came to verify what she heard. Years later, Chelsea said she didn't even remember making the call to Kathy. She admitted she was drinking that night. It was New Year's Eve. Her memory was fuzzy. She wasn't sure what she heard anymore. By then, too much time had passed. The memories weren't fresh, the emotions had dulled, and the record, the official police record, didn't match what people now claimed they'd said. Ashley's family believed it was no accident. Tom worked for Weld County. He wore a badge, had friends on the force. People knew him, respected him, protected him. Evans Police Department handled the investigation, but not well. Chief Brandt later admitted there were mistakes. He said officers should have followed up with Chelsea. Said maybe the case was closed too quickly. Said he wasn't the one in charge of every detail, but he was the chief. Ashley's parents didn't want excuses. They wanted accountability. Instead, what they got was a quiet closure, a death certificate that said suicide, and no one in power willing to challenge it until a journalist picked up the trail. Justin Joseph was an investigative reporter. A source inside law enforcement told him something was wrong with the case, that not everything had been reported, that maybe, just maybe, justice had been sidestepped. Justin dug in. He found the neighbors, the statements, the inconsistencies, the parts of the story that had been missed, ignored, or rewritten. And when he brought those facts to light, everything changed. The case was reopened in 2014, not by Evans PD, but by Fort Collins Police Department, a different city, a different team, a fresh start. And finally, after years of silence, someone else listened. The system had failed Ashley in life, but maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't fail her in death. By 2014, 2 long years had passed since Ashley Fowlis was found shot in the head on New Year's Eve. Her death had been ruled a suicide almost immediately, before toxicology results, before gunshot residue tests, before a single forensic expert had examined the evidence thoroughly. But now, thanks to the persistence of investigative journalist Justin Joseph and the voices of neighbors who refused to be silenced, the case was being pulled back into the light. This time, Fort Collins Police took over. They weren't part of the same circles as the officers from Weld County. They had no loyalty to Tom Fowlis or the people who had rushed to close the case. They came in clean with one mission: figure out what really happened to Ashley. It was like opening a cold case. But it wasn't cold. Not to Ashley's parents, Jenna and Joel. Not to her 3 children, who had been swept away to Indiana with the man they believed to be their father. Not to the neighbors who still remembered the sounds that night, the yelling, the screaming, the chaos. Now, Fort Collins detectives began re-interviewing witnesses. Neighbors who had been dismissed were brought in again. This time, they were listened to. Their original stories were compared to the official reports, and the discrepancies stood out like bruises on bare skin. Nick Glover, 15 years old when it happened, repeated what he had said that night. He had watched from his window as Tom walked out to the driveway, visibly shaken, and told his own parents, "I shot her." His mother, Kathy, backed him up. She had heard the confession too. She remembered calling another neighbor in a panic. But when that same neighbor, Chelsea, was brought back in, she couldn't confirm it. She admitted she had been drinking heavily. She wasn't sure what she heard. Her memory was foggy now. What once had felt like a scream, "Get off me!" now lived in a haze of doubt. Even so, the cracks were obvious. Tom's version of events: Ashley walked into the room, pulled a gun from under the bed, and shot herself while he was across the room, didn't fit what forensic analysts later saw. Why were framed pictures knocked from the walls? Why was a flashlight found near her body, a heavy one that didn't belong in the bedroom? Why were there fresh bruises on Ashley's legs? Why was Tom's DNA found under her fingernails? Why were divorce papers sitting out in plain view? And why, most of all, had none of this mattered in the original investigation? The new investigators brought in forensic experts, crime scene analysts, gunshot residue specialists. They recreated the timeline, mapped out every movement, measured the angle of the bullet, the location of blood spatter, and the placement of objects in the room. What they found didn't support a clean suicide. The angle of the gunshot was difficult to reconcile with someone shooting themselves. The bruising on Ashley's legs suggested a struggle, and the DNA under her fingernails implied physical contact shortly before she died. Then there was the gun. Tom had claimed Ashley kept it under her mattress, but it was a heavy 9mm Taurus, not easy to handle. Not the kind of weapon easily lifted, cocked, and fired by someone in the position Tom described. And then came the flashlight. Found near her body, it had no business being there. It wasn't a regular household flashlight. It was a large metal tactical one, the kind used by law enforcement. Some speculated that it could have been used to subdue her, to knock her down before the fatal shot. That theory fit the bruises on her legs. Investigators believed Tom may have struck her, possibly to force her to her knees before pulling the trigger. If that were true, it was murder. Cold, calculated, and brutal. Even more dissonant or disturbing was the suggestion that after the shooting, Tom may have staged the scene to look like a suicide. He told 911 his wife had shot herself. He was crying, screaming, panicked. But his story didn't line up. He said she was alive when he called, but autopsy reports suggested otherwise. He claimed she had shot herself while he was in the closet. But based on timing and positioning, experts believed he had to have been near her, perhaps even touching her, when the gun went off. It wasn't just a matter of who fired the weapon. It was about intent, about control, about a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Tom had always needed control over Ashley, over the household, over the narrative. Now, finally, he was losing it. In November 2014, a grand jury indicted Tom Fallis for the second-degree murder of Ashley Fallis. The next day, he was arrested in Indiana, where he had moved with the children. He had thought he was in the clear, that he had escaped scrutiny, but the truth, once buried, was clawing its way back into daylight. Ashley's family felt the first flicker of hope. Not closure, that wouldn't come for a long time, if ever. But justice? That was finally back on the table. The courtroom in Greeley, Colorado was tense from the start. It had taken nearly 4 years to get here. 4 years since Ashley Fallis was shot in her own bedroom, with her children just down the hall. 4 years since her husband, Tom Fallis, had called 911 and claimed she had taken her own life. 4 years of questions that went unanswered, evidence that was ignored, and witnesses who had been silenced or overlooked. Now, it was time for the jury to hear what really happened on that New Year's Eve in 2011. Tom Fallis sat at the defense table, wearing a suit and tie. He looked calm, but tight, controlled, just like people remembered him. His face was clean-shaven, his hands folded, his expression neutral. But those who had lived her through the events, Ashley's family, the neighbors who heard her scream, the people who knew her best, could still see the tension under his skin. Across the room sat Jenna and Joel, Ashley's parents. Their eyes were fixed on the prosecutors. For them, this trial wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about telling their daughter's story the way it should have been told from the beginning. The prosecution started with what they believed to be a clear pattern: control, emotional abuse, and escalating anger. They described Ashley as bright, devoted, and full of life, a mother of three, a woman who faced challenges but always fought back, a woman who had gone to Washington to fight for her son's medical condition, who never backed down from anything. She was the kind of person who pushed through, the prosecutor said in opening statements. She wasn't someone who gave up, and she didn't take her own life that night. She had it taken from her. They laid out the timeline: the New Year's Eve party, the argument, the threats, the neighbors who heard Tom yelling, the sudden silence, the 911 call. They brought in Nicholas Glover, the boy who had watched from his window and said he heard Tom confess to his parents, "I shot her." They brought in Tom's coworkers who remembered his temper, who talked about his need for dominance and control. They talked about the bruises on Ashley's legs, the flashlight near her body, the divorce papers, the way Tom acted at the scene, yelling, aggressive, trying to take charge even when his wife was dying. And they brought in the forensic animator, Scott Roeder, who had recreated the crime scene. His findings didn't definitively prove murder, but they made one thing clear: Tom's story didn't make sense. Roeder's animation showed how unlikely it was that Ashley had shot herself from the angle Tom described. He showed that the physical evidence in the room, especially the location of the gun, the bruises, and the knocked over photos, matched a struggle, not a suicide. But the defense fought back hard. They painted Ashley as overwhelmed, emotional, and struggling with her mental health. They pointed to her miscarriage, her decision to stop taking anxiety medication, and a note, typed and handwritten, that Tom claimed she had left behind. The typed note read, "Dear Tom, I'm sorry for your pain. I am a failure at everything. I find myself not even liking my children. I just cannot take this life any longer." To Ashley's family, it was unthinkable. Jenna sat in the courtroom, shaking her head. She would never say that. She loved those kids more than anything. There is no way she wrote that. And it hadn't even been mentioned until years after her death. But the defense used it. They argued that Ashley had made an impulsive, tragic decision, that Tom had walked in too late, that the yelling earlier in the evening had nothing to do with what happened after midnight. They questioned the credibility of the witnesses. Nicholas was just a teenager, they said. His memory couldn't be trusted. Chelsea, the neighbor who heard screaming, had been drinking and didn't remember the phone call. Even the officer who said he heard Tom confess had waited 2 years to come forward. Too late, too questionable. The defense experts said the gunshot could have been self-inflicted. They explained that suicide, especially in moments of deep emotional distress, could look sudden, even shocking. And the jury listened. For 2 weeks they heard every detail, every expert, every photo, every piece of the puzzle. Ashley's children didn't testify. They were too young at the time of the shooting to understand what they had witnessed, and their statements had been inconsistent, partly because no trained child interviewers had been present that night. In the end, the jury was left with a question: not just, did Tom Fallis shoot his wife, but can we be absolutely sure? That was the burden they had to meet, beyond a reasonable doubt. And after only 3.5 hours of deliberation, they came back with their verdict: not guilty. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Tom Fallis stood and hugged his defense team. His family wept with relief. On the other side of the aisle, Jenna sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the floor. Joel held her hand, but said nothing. They didn't cry, they didn't scream, but in that moment, something inside them closed. Another door slammed shut on the truth. The courtroom emptied quickly, but for Ashley's family, time slowed to a crawl. Not guilty. 2 words that hung in the air like smoke they couldn't clear. Jenna stared at the floor for a long time. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't follow the reporters outside, didn't even look at Tom Fallis. There was nothing left to say. Her daughter was gone, and the man she believed responsible had just walked free. Again. For Joel, it felt like being punched without warning. "It wasn't even close," he said later. 3.5 hours. That's not a jury wrestling with doubt. That's a jury who already made up their minds. But legally, it was over. Tom Fallis walked out of court that day, no longer a defendant, no longer a suspect. Whatever anyone believed, whatever the neighbors had heard, whatever the bruises had meant, he was a free man. Ashley's family went home and sat in silence. It wasn't just grief, it was disbelief, a kind of numbness that didn't fade. That night, Jenna pulled out old photos, Ashley as a toddler, in Halloween costumes as a teenager at prom, her smile in every frame. "She was so full of life," Jenna whispered, "and they took that from her. And now they want us to believe she just threw it away?" She didn't believe it. She never would. Neither did Joel. They still remembered the New Year's Eve party, the plans for a Super Bowl party just weeks later. Ashley hadn't been saying goodbye. She had been looking forward, laughing, hosting family, making plans. And she had told them just 10 minutes before the shooting that she loved them. She had kissed them goodbye. That wasn't someone planning to end her life, but what mattered in court was proof. And the system, for all its intentions, had failed to put the full story in front of that jury. Ashley's children, Madeline, Jolie, and Blake, remained in Indiana with Tom's parents. Jenna and Joel still visited, still made the trips, still tried to keep Ashley's memory alive for them, but they couldn't bring their daughter back, and they couldn't tell the children everything, not yet. "You can't grow up with that burden," Jenna said once. "Not until they're ready to ask. And even then, we'll have to choose our words carefully." Because this wasn't just about tragedy. It was about the cracks in a system that missed the signs, ignored the red flags, and failed to act. The officers who didn't properly interview witnesses. The medical examiner who ruled suicide before the forensic reports came back. The neighbor who called 911 and was never interviewed again. The scratches, the bruises, the screams. Every warning signal had been muted, watered down, or dismissed. And Tom's story, riddled with holes, had been accepted as reasonable doubt. Ashley's name began to fade from headlines. Other cases came, other trials, the world moved on. But Jenna didn't. She became a voice for victims' families, especially those caught in the gray zone between homicide and suicide. She spoke at events. She sat on panels. She told Ashley's story again and again. Not for justice anymore, but for awareness. "I want people to know what happens when a case isn't taken seriously," she said. "What happens when shortcuts are made, when people believe a story just because it's convenient." Joel stayed quieter, but his focus never shifted. He worked quietly behind the scenes, writing letters, supporting Jenna, pushing for reform in how law enforcement handled domestic violence-related deaths. In time, the family set up a scholarship in Ashley's name for young women pursuing careers in healthcare. They wanted her legacy to be about hope, not just pain. But every New Year's Eve, Jenna sat alone for a few minutes. The house would be quiet, the clock would tick toward midnight, and she would whisper the same thing each year. "I miss you, Ash. I'm sorry we couldn't save you." Because in the end, the verdict was just a verdict. Ashley was still gone. And the truth, whatever it was, would live in silence. Even after the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines disappeared, Ashley Fallis' death left a mark, not just on her family, but on the community she called home. Evans, Colorado was a quiet place, not the kind of town where you expected violent crime, and certainly not the kind where a mother of 3 would die in the early hours of New Year's Day, surrounded by family, then have the whole thing ruled a suicide within days. People whispered, not just about the tragedy, but about the cracks they had seen from the start. "I remember when the news broke," one neighbor said. They said she shot herself, but anyone who knew her, it didn't add up. For many, what followed was worse than the loss. It was the way the case was handled. Mistakes, omissions, things that just didn't sit right. The gunshot, the bruises, the neighbors who weren't re-interviewed, the inconsistent statements from the children, and the fact that Tom Fallis was part of the local law enforcement world made it harder for some to believe the process was entirely fair. Was there a cover-up or just incompetence? Either way, people didn't forget. In the months after the trial, a quiet reckoning started in the Evans Police Department. Policies were reviewed, new training was offered. Officers were reminded directly that domestic disputes could turn deadly. That trauma could mask itself in silence. That first impressions weren't always the truth, but the truth about Ashley remained murky. Local advocacy groups, especially those supporting victims of domestic violence, used her case in trainings and workshops. The Fallis case, they called it, not for the verdict, but for the warning signs that were missed. This wasn't about a stranger in the night, one speaker told a community panel. It was about a husband and wife. It was about control. It was about escalation. And it ended with a gun. They pointed out how many of these stories follow a pattern: quick relationships, jealousy, isolation, emotional control. In Ashley's case, there was even more. An unexpected pregnancy, a miscarriage, medication changes, a New Year's Eve party, and a blow-up that neighbors overheard. This should have been investigated as a homicide from the start, one victim advocate said flatly. Even those who didn't know Ashley personally started asking harder questions. People asked for more transparency from law enforcement. They pushed for better oversight when one of their own was involved in a case. They wanted answers. And maybe they wanted someone to say what they suspected all along, that the system failed Ashley. Not everyone believed she was murdered, but nearly everyone agreed the investigation hadn't been handled with the care it deserved. Meanwhile, Ashley's face, smiling in old family photos, was still shown at vigils and fundraisers. Her name, no longer just a headline, became a symbol, a reminder of how quickly trust can be broken and how hard it is to get justice once it's lost. Her children grew up with questions. They were too young to remember all the details of that night, but they would grow into them. And someday, they'd want answers too. Would they be told the full story? Would they be shielded from the darker parts? Would they believe the verdict? Jenna and Joel didn't know, but they hoped, desperately, that when that day came, their grandchildren would at least know this. Ashley Fallis was loved. She was strong. She stood up for her son, for her family, and for what mattered. She didn't walk away from hard things. She faced them. And she deserved better. The community slowly began to agree. The name Ashley Fallis became part of the town's memory, not as a woman who broke, but as a woman who was failed, not just by a man, but by the very people meant to protect her. Despite everything, Tom Fallis walked free. He was found not guilty, and the law closed its case. But for Ashley's family, the story was far from over. Jenna and Joel were left shattered, not just by the loss of their daughter, but by the reality that her children were now being raised far from them, under the care of the man they believed had taken Ashley's life. Still, for the sake of those kids, they chose to keep the peace. They kept in contact with Tom. They stayed close enough to stay in their grandchildren's lives, because in the end, love for those children outweighed their anger. Ashley's family held on to what they knew to be true. They knew Ashley loved life. They knew she loved her kids fiercely. They knew she didn't choose to leave them behind. They never stopped believing she was taken from them. And while no court could give them the justice they hoped for, they kept her memory alive. In every photo, every story told to her children, every birthday missed, every tear quietly shed, Ashley Fallis lived on. This is her story. A young mother, full of spark, full of fight, gone too soon. And to this day, the people who loved her most still carry her with them. And that's where we'll end tonight's case, the tragic story of Ashley Fallis. If you found this story powerful or eye-opening, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who follows true crime. It helps the channel grow and makes it easier for others to find these important stories. We'll be back tomorrow with another case. Until then, stay safe, take care of yourself, and thanks for spending your night with us.